Okay, so thank you very much to all clusters that are connected now for this new lesson number 3 of our digital training on public procurement in the USA and Canada. For sure, we ask the speakers. So we have Mark Neil connected, and after we have 2 more speakers that is going to present today, and that maybe we let Mark to introduce them just after. Just as usual, some words, because we have many things to discuss and to improve our knowledge about public procurement in the USA today. We are running this digital training that I remember to all the cluster manager and all connected companies to these meetings, divided in 3 modules. Today we start with the general feature and general part in the US USA market. This is the first part of 2 parts related to module 1 for the USA. After that, we have module 3 with the eligibility requirements, and module 3 with meet the buyer email partnership that are scheduled just after this first part. So we just run our first 2 lessons on Canada. And today we start with USA, and so we have first part today, the 2nd of November, and after we have the schedule for the 16th of November, the second part of the general feature on the USA market. And as usual, you can have a look to the complete calendar that is on the video in this moment. I remember to cluster manager and to the companies that we are going to let available in the ELCA channel in YouTube, the registration of previous lesson and future lessons with a private link that we are going to give you in I hope in a couple of days, and that after you can share with the company that could attend the module before. And as for the project, it's very important to have the proof of following this module. I also ask our cluster manager to ask to the company just to leave comments in the YouTube channel that they attend the module when they connect to attend that. So it's very important to count number of companies that are following or will follow the lessons in future in about public procurement. Okay, so thank you again to Mark to be here today, and with our first part on public procurement USA today, and lesson 3 and lesson 4 the existing with a very wide explanation about public procurement in USA market. For clusters, we have or we can confirm that all clusters are connected. So I introduce usually myself, ELCA Luce Veneto President, Alberto Sozza. After we have Marta Cracovia from ELCA connected, Antonella Venzo from Luce Veneto, Cluster Manager. We have Mary Edith, Cluster Project Manager from Cluster Lumiere connected. Jordi Ortiz from Secartis connected, and after so Isabella Mantello connected. I don't know if Stefan is with us today, but
Stefan could not come today, unfortunately, so I'm representing the BIC today.
Okay, perfect. But all cluster managers are here. Also some couple of companies connected. So, but I remember that we let available the registration for all companies interested to go deeper in this subject. So this very short introduction as usual, and I give the floor to Mark Neil for this very interesting afternoon on the public procurement in USA. Thank you, Mark, to all the speakers.
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. I will try to make government procurement as interesting as possible. No promises there. My colleague does appear to, oh, never mind, he's unable to join. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into my section of the slides. And then we will go back if and when needed. So good afternoon. This is the first module in a set of 3 modules for procurement in the USA. The purpose of this training is I'm going to be educating this consortium group for what it takes to bid in the USA. And we will cover in this session general features of the procurement. And then in future sessions, we will get into much more detail about the requirements, assessment criteria, how you might partner with other people, recommended best practices, how you maximize your ability to win procurements. So those are some things to look forward to. Today's agenda, what we'll cover is provide some education on the different levels of the US government, because they are not all the same and they don't act the same. We will be going over how to do business in the US. So that covers everything from the World Trade Organization to trade agreements, free trade agreements, how you register your company, some particular numbers you might have to get as far as like product codes or IRS numbers or DUNS numbers. And then how do you put this on easy mode? How do you get some third-party help? Because obviously not everyone's an expert in this and some people are. We'll take a little bit of a break because by then you'll need one. And then we'll move into the actual federal procurement. So getting an understanding of the regulations, what the purchasing thresholds are and why they exist and how they operate, some special designations, special classifications to be aware of, and then also the different types of documents that you might see in the various procurements, as well as some helpful links and resources. So who is this training for? This is for my European colleagues who wish to participate in the US public procurement, who either have at a very small level or they're brand new to it. Maybe they've never done business here in the US. So what does that look like? What might that entail? As well as maybe you have some US experience, but it's in the private sector and you're unfamiliar with how the government works. It works quite differently than the private sector. And then the level of this is that each of these topics can be trainings in and of themselves that I'll go over. So what I'll provide here today is basically an entry to mid-level introduction to the topics. And then that should be able to educate you enough to do research at a deeper level if you wish. About myself, I've been bidding on government contracts and private sector contracts for over 10 years now. Ooh, I'm getting old. Commercial operations, I ran that for a Fortune 10 company here in the US. So I had quite a bit of exposure to RFPs and those kind of documents and processes throughout the world. And then I also have bid at all different levels. So I've bid for contracts here on the federal level, the state and local, and we'll get into what the differences are there. And then just so you can know where I'm located, I'm here in the southeastern United States in the lovely city of Atlanta, Georgia. So you might hear y'all every once in a while from me. All right, so ground rules for today.
Wow.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I first I didn't have the sound and now I don't have my video. I'm sorry, I apologize about that. This is Jabril.
No worries about that. Some ground rules for today's session. Pretty easy going. This session is for your benefit. So speak up and speak out often if something doesn't make sense. I understand that English may not be a first language for many of you. And so if I'm using words or terms that that you would like clarification on, I'm happy to stop and clarify those things, answer your questions if I'm able to. Some questions may be required to go into what I could term as a parking lot. So if it's going to take a lot of time or it's only applicable to a small group of people here, I might ask that we put it in a parking lot to be respectful of everyone's time. And then I'll come back to that question during a break or at the end of the presentation to go in to give it the time that it needs. Some digital etiquette, if I may. Brave new world here with going remote. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We try to give a distraction-free environment to all of our colleagues here on this training. And then the intention of this training. It's meant to be educational, informative. It is not meant to be prescriptive, meaning that you can take this training and your company specifically for your specific needs and particulars can then go out and bid just with this training alone. It should give you a lot of context. It should give you the ability to know a lot about the environment. And so that is the scope of this training. I will pause here and ask if there are any questions or any statements that anyone would like to make before I jump into the topics. All right. So the different levels of the US government. The goal of this part of the training is to familiarize yourself with the 3 different levels. So here in the US, government means different things depending on who and what you're talking about. And they control different parts. They operate differently when you're looking to bid on procurement. They all do operate, however, very similarly in the fact that they do need to go out for competitive bids most times. There are occasions where they can buy directly from you without a bid, and I'll get into that, but let's jump in. So there are 3 different levels. There's the federal, so it is a single buyer. Uncle Sam, it is many agencies, but it's essentially the biggest buyer of goods and services here in the US. The next level would be the states. So we have the 50 states, the District of Columbia. We also have the territories, might be the US Virgin Islands, the Marshall Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam. All of them kind of operate under this umbrella of like the state level, even though the territories are not officially states. And then local. This can be a variety, a hodgepodge of different municipal governments, everything from counties to parishes down in Louisiana from our French legacy. There's over 3,100 of those to deal with. So each of them have their own particulars. Cities, towns, and villages, depending how you classify them, there's about 19,000 of them to 20,000, depending how you're counting it. One key statistic here is that at the lower levels, you'll see that less than 5,000 people or less live in about 75% of the cities or towns or villages. So to say it differently, many of the places, if you choose to bid at the local level, will be very low populations. Low populations typically mean low tax base, meaning low budgets. Conversely, about only 10%, 1 in 10, of the cities, towns, and villages have more than 1 million people. So think of like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Miami, Atlanta, your bigger cities. Those would be the ones that I would go after if you were to look at this level of government for procurement. And then certainly last but not least in this is the tribal governments. So in our history, we do have, the Navajo, the Cherokee, for example, have their own forms of government, and they do operate independently of the counties, the towns, and the villages. And I would lump them in as at the local level. You could lump them in at the state level, depending how you look at it. All right, let's dive into the federal government if we can. All right, so it represents about 250 government agencies. The reason I have plus there is because it's always growing. It's never a definite number. And what they do is they procure things for the national defense and for the public welfare and everything in between. So if the government needs to buy it, this is how they do it. They have the authority to regulate laws at the state level. And there's always a little bit of a battle between the states and the federal government about who can do what. But essentially, if the federal government makes a law, the states generally follow it for general rules, keeping it high level. What is their budget? So they've got about $5 trillion annually is what the US spends, but in procurement alone, so what we're interested here, it's about 600 billion. That is still a lot of money. Number of contracts awarded. So this is a key one here. So the pie is very large. It's about 5.8 million individual contracts that were awarded by the US government, the federal government, in fiscal year last year. They are the single largest buyer of goods and services here in the US. So if you're looking to where to focus your efforts, where to spend your time, if you're looking to get into the US procurement market, my suggestion would be the federal level. It's the easiest, it's the most comprehensive, it's the biggest, and it is the most well-defined. And we'll get into that here in a minute. Their budget source. So everything comes back to money, sadly. Where do they get their money? They're self-funded. They can print their own money. Congress can set their own budgets. It's virtually unlimited. And so that's what we're looking at here. So the federal government, who purchases? So it is one big entity, Uncle Sam, but there are different agencies within the government that can do the purchasing. One that we'll become familiar with in this training is called the General Services Administration, sometimes referred to as the GSA. So if I start using letter acronyms here, and if you ever need me to clarify that, please let me know. Sometimes it can be a bit of an alphabet soup here. Their sole goal is to procure for the federal government, set standards, negotiate contracts on behalf of other agencies. So those agencies can focus on their mission, whether it's national defense or whether it's agriculture or the interior, managing our forests, things like that. Let those people focus on what they know how to do and let the GSA figure out how to buy. There are very key exceptions here. So the Department of Defense is the single largest buyer outside of the GSA. The Department of Energy obviously has some nuclear items. They have very specific procurement needs that a general services agency would not know how to do. And then you've got NASA and Veterans Affairs. So it's not that there's one department for everything, but as a good starting point, GSA is a good place to look. All right. State governments. So now we've gone from the highest level, we're now going down to the middle level. As you can see here, there's a lovely map of my home country. And what does each state do? So each state procures goods and services similar to the federal government, same mandate, but within their borders. So for instance, the state of Georgia, where I'm from, would not procure things for the state of California. Similarly, Nebraska would not buy things for Oklahoma. Some key differences here from the federal government is that even though there were 250 plus agencies at the federal level, you've got 50 states here within, and those 250 agencies operate under more or less a single set of guidelines. Each of these 50 states are like little countries in and of themselves. They have 50 different processes. So the level of complexity, the level of familiarity, the general principles still hold. So it's like learning to ride a bike. You can change out the bike, you still know how to ride it, but it does operate differently. A mountain bike from a trick bike from, just a street cruiser. Their budgets vary wildly. Again, population size, tax base, what kind of industries do they have? So for example, I've got the two ends of the spectrum here. You got California over at, close to $500 billion at 400 billion. And then you've got Wyoming, one of our least populated states, that has about 6.6 billion. And so you can see that the budgets mean how much they can use to buy, what they can procure. So if you're looking to target where to sell your goods, budgets are a good place to start for that. Next, we look at the state procurement. So if we looked at them as one single entity, even though they're not, they're about 4.2 trillion. So a very healthy level of procurement going on. But again, it's complex. It's different between each state. It's not as easy as working with the federal government. Another key difference here is that the non-compete thresholds, and we'll get into the purchasing levels later on in this presentation, but they can be higher at the state level. So because each state can set their own rules. Some states say, okay, if you're going to sell me something that's $30,000 or less, the person buying at the state level can buy that without a competitive bid. Whereas at the federal level, that can vary between 10 and 20,000. So there are some key differences there. A note on budget sources. Again, everything comes back to money. The states have their own tax base. They can raise their own money, but they also get grants. They also get federal dollars from Uncle Sam. And so their budgets are not fully in their control. Said differently, if the federal government decides to change the amount of money given to a state, that's not within the state's control. And so these spending numbers can change year to year, depending on how much money the states themselves can raise and how much the federal government is going to give them. All right, local government. So this is, the lowest level of government in terms of like day-to-day operations. the amount of land that, oh, yes,
One question on the federal level, the state level, sorry.
yes.
Do states usually have something similar to GSA? Like meaning some sort of agency that does the purchase, or every single agency at the state level have their own purchase process?
Very insightful question. Yes and no. So some of your bigger states like California will have one of those agencies. And it again comes down to how big is their budget? Can they afford a department like that? So some states may say, look, every department, agriculture, transportation, human services, you each procure your own, or they might say, hey, we've got a big enough budget that we can hire our own department and we'll do that for you. So it really varies between each state.
Okay. And usually the acronyms that they have, are they similar to GSA in order to identify them, or?
Yes and no. You know where I'm going with this. So I think as a general principle, if you understand the underlying concepts, which we'll go through here at the federal level, and I'm going to keep it at the federal level just because that's the easiest to understand, they can apply very easily to the state level.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Excellent question. Yeah, excellent questions. Keep them coming. All right, local government. So this is, now you can see the map here. You can see all the, hopefully you can, this is coming through all the different lines and just how small it is. And, you know, there's over, 19, 20,000 different agencies that you might be dealing with. So you can imagine the variety of standards, the level of proficiency, what you might be dealing with here. But what does this look like? So if the states were at, 4.2 trillion, the federal government was at, half a trillion, 600 billion. The states are around 2 trillion. I mean, the local government is around 2 trillion in annual activity here. This, I think, goes more to your question. These local municipalities, as a general rule, will have fewer staff. They have lower budgets. They do not have a dedicated procurement team. So in these instances, many times I deal, when I'm at the local level, directly with the buyer. And so it's much more of a, handshake. You do have to formalize with a contract, but you're able to help guide that process a bit more. And we'll get into that in future modules about how you might set yourself up better to win opportunities by educating your client, by influencing the procurement before it comes out, and some of the things that you can do before the actual RFP comes out. Here you're at the most limited budget level. Again, their tax base is going to be smaller. They're more dependent on the state and federal governments for funding. And so the amount that they can buy is just going to be less, just simply because their tax base is less. Any questions here before I move on? All right. So we're now experts on the US, doing business in the US. So here, some goals that we're going to go over and cover here is, so as Europeans, what does it mean to do business here in the US? What are you allowed to do? What aren't you allowed to do? How are you looked at? How are you treated compared to domestic US companies that are looking to bid on these? So we'll go over some World Trade Organizations stuff, some general agreements, some trade agreement provisions here. Also, we'll learn, how do you get started? So if you're coming here and you don't know what to do, I'll run you through some high-level steps to get started. We'll understand some key terms. Because knowing those terms, again, if you understand the general framework, they can change out the words, but you'll understand the concepts underneath and you'll very easily be able to adapt. And then also understanding your options for assistance, because these processes can be time consuming, they can be complex. And so, asking for help or having someone right alongside you that can guide you, if you wish, can be an option. All right. I'm going to pause here and ask Jabril, are you able to, is your stuff working to go through your introduction, or should I keep going?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to stop I'm actually going to go out and go back to the beginning and turn it over to my colleague here. Take it away, Jabril.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And great to meet you, everyone. So my name is Jabril Ben Sedrin. We have with us also our colleague, John Arts. We don't have the same level of expertise as Mark in the entire process, more as experiencing it on different angles. As far as I'm concerned, I'm the founder of the Triana Group based in New York City. And I've been in the US for 22 years, mostly focused on business development strategy for technology companies, or generally speaking, let's say technical products. My experience with different levels of the federal funding, state and cities, mostly on the grants part, not really selling anything specifically, but receiving free money, or not exactly free, but as a recipient, as a team member, helping different teams, even startups sometimes receive funds from the government, different agencies. John Arts brings 5 years of experience working for a state government, so knowing the government process from the inside, as well as 20 years in healthcare and higher education, colleges, universities, which many of them are part of, not all of them, but part of a state level, or maybe even federal, since the veterans and so on are part of the federal government. So has a very good understanding of their procurement processes, and John will share some of his insights from that perspective, and then I'll share some also general case studies, lessons learned from the business development side, because if you're interested, you or companies within your groups are interested in RFPs and selling to these different levels of the government, that means they're also going to develop a business development strategy for the US market. So I'll share some experience there. So we won't take too long. We can go to the next slide. Just as a general background, I'm sure you've all familiar with the market size and the general trends of the economy, but to put things in perspective, you see here represented visually the market size of the United States versus Canada and other countries. The trend that has been really felt really strongly by all of us in 2020-21 is now more or less recovered. There is some dip, as you may know from, we can move to the next slide. You'll see so some of the current trends. I'm sure many of you have these kinds of questions in mind. What about the inflation rate, the exchange rate, the consumer confidence, and so on? And generally, there are some cause for concern, depending on which industry you are, though it, as you see, for example, in terms of employment, it has varied considerably depending on which sector. The US still has a very low unemployment rate, and the inflation, though, is very strong. But partly due to circumstances, though, so I'm not sure that would affect really the long-term the economy, and the dollar, though, exchange rate to euro has been evolving really strongly, so that might actually be potentially favorable right now. It's hard to tell how it's going to evolve, but as you could see right now, definitely there's there's almost 20% difference compared to just a few months ago, and that makes a big difference. The consumer confidence index is, as you see, also again, it's been much lower. There are some causes for concern, partly due to the inflation. Most of the Americans are looking at reducing their expenses in this holiday season, or at least trying to shop for value. That being said, it probably would not affect directly your bidding strategy. You're really dealing with a whole different type of environment, and the U.S. government is investing massively in infrastructure. I'm sure Mark can speak about that, and so that includes your sectors. So it's probably the right time. We can go to the next slide. And here I'd like.
Sorry, Jabril. I
yeah.
see Mary's raised her hand a
Oh,
couple of
thank
minutes
you.
ago.
Yeah,
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah.
No, I just want to, I'm not sure if, hi, Jabril, it's Mary
Hi.
from Crystal Lumiere. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Fine. I just want to, the members from, I don't know if Antonella and also Alberto remember, but Jabril passed by our booth at ICFF and you met everybody, but I'm not sure if everybody remembers. So I just wanted to point out that we've already been in contact and we know you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's great to meet.
It was nice to see you at ICFF.
Yeah. Thank you. It's looking forward to next time.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, you can continue. I just wanted so everybody could, I point that out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I did have some technical difficulties here during the intro, so thanks for that. I skipped that part.
No problem.
So I don't know if John is with us, but at this point, John could share his experience, lesson learned from a business development and sales executive perspective, his lessons learned regarding the RFP process.
Thank you, Jabril and everybody. Apologies, my video is not working this morning, but hopefully the next segment will be back on. As Jabril mentioned earlier, I have an inside-out type of knowledge base when it comes to bids and also known as RFPs. And I came from I worked for New York State. As you can tell by my accent, I am from New York. If you don't detect it now, you will detect it within probably the next couple of minutes. But I worked for New York State for a few years after university. And then I got into sales and had many different roles within sales, from management to operations to running my own company, and so on. But what is very constant when we deal with these bids or again RFPs, they don't come to you just like in anything in life. You have to go out and get it and seek it out. And as Mark mentioned earlier, there were basically 20,000 types of governments, micro governments within the US. And to know where every single bid or RFP is almost an impossibility. There are some tools that you can use, but in the end, they're not coming to you typically. It's, that's a small percentage of the time you have to go out and look for those RFPs. And again, there are some tools that you can use. You have to really understand the genesis of when this is, the RFP is created, who's writing it, and really the most common denominator is that the folks that write these bids, and in most cases these bids are very lengthy, could be dozens and dozens of pages to fill out. They're not quite certain of the product or the service that is being asked for, because they deal with bids every single day. They're just procurement folks. So they might know a little bit about paper clips, but when it comes to a service like house cleaning, they may not know much about anything. So when you receive the bids, it may be very general, and you might have those questions. Well, why didn't they be more descriptive? And there is always and Mark will go through it in further detail, but there's always a period of time where you can ask questions, and then they scratch their heads and say, oh yeah, maybe we should have put that in there. I think the most important thing for everyone on the phone here is when you get that bid and you open it up like a Christmas present and you say, wow, we have this great opportunity. You really need to take a step back and ask a lot of questions, and you have to evaluate this opportunity, and you say, all right, what are they asking for? do we truly match up with what they're asking for? Or are we just kind of like finding a little, sliver of hope? The last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time on what you think is an opportunity, and then you put resources and time and energy into it, and then in the end, you're not going to meet all the specifications that they ask for. So sometimes it's okay to walk away and say, no, this is not for us, than to waste, weeks and sometimes, a couple of months and energy on these things. So just you have to be very honest with yourself there. The most probably the next most important thing is if you're going to go forward and complete the RFP, the bid, and also the RFQs as well. That's a questionnaire, but that's not as detailed. But make sure you have the right person who is going to be the leader, who's going to be the one that's accountable, and also the director of the bid. With, again, usually dozens of pages to fill out. There's business information, there's sales information, there's marketing information, there's you could have there's someone who's got to be the point person to say to each individual, you're in charge of these items, and I'm in charge of these items, and so on. Without that competent person, the wheels will fall off the bus. And as in any business, you need to have somebody who's going to give the direction there. But it's always good to have somebody who knows about RFPs and can keep everybody on point. Next thing I want to talk about is what Mark again addressed, that there's 20,000 little micro governments here. There's the big federal government and state, and then everything under those under the states. But if you've seen one RFP, you've seen one RFP, and what that means is they all look a little bit different from the next one. It's good to have one in, a good one in your pocket, or you have one on file. It can help you fill out information later on because you've already done it. But you'd be very surprised the questions that are asked or information that is asked of, and you would scratch your head and say, why are they asking for this information? Things that you'd see is, of course, references or years in business, but they might ask for information that is not maybe not so common on every RFP. So don't be fearful that one looks different from the next. When responding to the bids, the RFPs, they will ask for a reference, as I kind of just mentioned before, or existing business that you have, so those are things to be mindful of. And in a lot of cases, especially when you're dealing with governments, they like to know that you have stamps of approval, a license, an award. They're just as much important as having a reference. If you think about governments across the world globally, I think we would all agree that bureaucracy is consistent throughout. That not always does the left hand help the right hand, or does government know exactly what they're doing. But what they do to help them sort through things like an RFP is having a license, an award, anything that mentions this is why we do business, and we've been approved by this group. So that would be very helpful. And just lastly, I'll just give a quick anecdote, and this involves Mark as well. Mark and I worked recently over the last let's say it's late 2020 up until and present day, working with the state of New York on a PPE bid. I'm pretty certain that most folks by now in the world know what PPE is, but that's personal protective equipment. So we were working with a manufacturer to get them on this contract. Fast forward today, this company is the only manufacturer of this product that was allowed on this contract. That's a 5-year agreement. So now the state of New York and any municipality or entity under New York State can use this contract when they want to buy this one particular product. But this was not a very simple standard bid. As I mentioned earlier, you've seen one bid, you've seen one bid. With COVID appearing in our lives in 2020, that changed the rules, and it also changed how everybody was thinking from a business standpoint as well. And a bid was given out in late 2020. First, it was a questionnaire. Excuse me. It was actually a questionnaire first, and the questionnaire originally gave us 3 weeks to respond, and then after all the questions came in from the manufacturers and the suppliers and the vendors, they realized they had no idea what they were in for, and they had a pause, and they sent out a note to all the vendors saying, we really don't know what we're doing here. We need an extra 4 weeks to respond to all your questions. So lo and behold, another month will pass by, and the questions then were all answered, and they move forward with the RFP process. That took what was going to take 30, I think maybe 45 days, took nearly a year of back and forth, various conference calls, which they don't usually do. There was actually a point where they asked the vendors, if this is way too much for you, we understand if you want to drop out, and people and companies did drop out. But the long and the short about this process is, yes, it was a very unique situation, but the bid process went nearly, over a year and a half before they gave out the awards to 30 vendors out of hundreds of vendors. And there's all different types of PPE out there. We bid on one specific item. With that said, and then just to present day, as this company won the award, Mark and I continue to have our follow-ups with the state, and often the government entity might be asking the vendor, the manufacturer, the supplier, after you win the award, your work is not done. You have to report back in information such as sales. What were the sales for the month? Who did you sell to? Were there any items in there that we need to know about that were sold? So there's a lot of getting the RFP is one thing. Then you have to kind of give some foster the relationship after it, and you still have to answer to these local, state, and federal governments once it's done. So there needs to be a liaison to that particular government to make sure that the relationship is fostered and nothing just dries up and dies out on the vine. You got to make sure that you have that point person. In this instance, Mark is that point person, and he's on a regular basis, typically monthly, reporting data back and forth with New York State. These are just some, again, my perspective of how I see things. It's a ground level type of perspective, but yet it's pretty fair and honest. If there's any questions, I'm be happy to answer. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Mark.
and to Jabril.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Well, thank you, John. And so this is to give you a flavor of the process from a let's say a kind of a recipient perspective, meaning on the company side. And Mark has actually come highly recommended by John, actually, who has experienced the results of successful RP processes thanks to Mark's assistance. And so it's perfect. It's a great chance for you to have hear the story from the two sides. Here are just a couple minutes to share some typical success stories, and also sometimes lessons learned the hard way from companies that come to the US and try to capture new business. The most typical is the company that feels, usually for good reasons, that they have good technology and few competitors. And this is, of course, a highly simplified web image. But if you look at the reality in the next slide, we really find ourselves in a very crowded market space that has not only all the companies that are in the United States already, but companies coming from the whole world, right? And this is the image of all the tourists coming. And but really, the established markets are those people who are in the buildings already. And this is actually what you see on the right side are figures that are from a prior project we worked on, where we were helping a company that was in Europe, really competing very successfully against American companies. They were, and even really very large billion-dollar companies that were present in Europe. And that European company was winning the bids and when having really strong market share. And those are the main companies they knew. They knew of a few large multi-hundred-million-dollar company, maybe 3, 4, but that was their impression coming to the US market. And that's what they thought they were competing with. When we helped them identify the competition to really make sure that their competitive advantage would be successful when they bid for business, we found actually that, yes, you are the 3 top multi-billion-dollar competitors they knew, and some of the 20 multi-hundred-million-dollar, but they knew only 3 or 4 of them, and we found more. And there are also 96 companies that actually are in the same size as the company we were helping. The company we were helping was around $40 or $50 million in size. And so they discovered that competition. And then that's even not without talking about all those companies off the radar that would be, $10, $20 million. So this is an important point to keep in mind, that the competitive benchmarking should be thorough and done from the perspective of someone who's present in the US market. It doesn't mean that there is no space. It simply means that that helps you actually find exactly the right angle and the right fit, and be as laser focused as possible, like John was saying, in selecting the right bid where you will be actually the best or close to the best. So in the next slide, we have just kind of some suggestions about what you can do about it, right? In this case, in addition to having a competitive benchmarking that is really as thorough as possible, you can team up. And in this case, we have a couple of examples that really are represented not by the shark, but by a small fish. The companies we were helping were really part of the small fish around the shark. In one of the examples is a innovative company that was too small to really carry the entire bidding process alone, and even to probably win it. But what they did, they were very smart. They partnered with a larger company that integrated their product. The product could have tried to be sold alone, but they found an OEM, which is an original equipment manufacturer, meaning a larger company that really integrated the product in their offering, and that actually had all the capabilities needed, and it worked really well for them. And then another company that we helped that was also a very small Norwegian company, but they found a partner that was definitely not the multi-hundred million. Ideally, they would have liked to partner with those large companies that everybody heard about. But many people don't realize that it's actually easier to partner with a smaller company that itself has partnerships with the bigger companies. You need to go in two steps, and in this case, the partner was a Texas company, Texas-based. They would have never found them otherwise. It's a $50 million company, but very profitable, and that had all the relationships with the multi-billion-dollar companies. Not all, but really enough. And so they took them as part of their offering. So that also shows that thinking about bidding can also require some initial steps, which is having the right partners, and that could be a whole package basically that really works. In my experience, that works best. I've seen companies that try to go direct, and even with really the best expertise, doing it remotely is just very hard. Even just to be in the meetings, pre-bid meetings and so on, was just difficult to follow. So in the next slide, we have kind of an overview of what really to expect. This is based on actually a small kind of statistical, non-scientific statistical study that I've done on the 120 companies that we've helped over the past 14 years. And so starting a few years ago, started looking at each of them one by one, and what they've done, how they try to develop their strategy, and what happened to them. And what you see is generally 30% of them are, as any company should start with a go, no go assessment. Is there a market? Is it room for us, and so on? Should we invest or not? And a third of the companies usually end up saying, or we tell them you should use your money somewhere else. And then among those that stay, and they typically the wisest next step is to try, but not to invest, massively. Simply go, unless it's absolutely the only way to really build a presence. But generally test a little bit the market in an agile manner. The lean startup method applied to business development here. And a third of those companies actually also, well, a third of the total companies end up deciding that the test is not conclusive, and that they learned that it's actually better to not ramp up their investments. And then among those who actually decide that the test is conclusive and it's worth staying for the long term, it's not exactly half. Many of them stay modest, but others get 10% of the total become really large. By really large, meaning at the scale of the US market. So one company, for example, among them has made a deal with Amazon, $400 million deal. As you can imagine, that's the kind of example that I refer as a solid presence. So in the next slide, we just have one question, which is very often comes up, is what is the best strategy? And actually, there isn't, right? It's not we can say that exports is better, or partnerships, or direct strategy. The golden rule is generally, from observing again the 120 companies, is it's a combination of these, and it's evolving. So definitely you have to start somewhere, but you can also imagine starting somewhere with a little mix of both. So if you're doing export, also try to have a joint venture around it, like at the same time, or maybe a very small acquisition, but with an alliance and some export and so on and so forth. And the companies that have succeeded usually have if not like right away, but very quickly they add more. They stack different approaches. So, for example, going greenfield, but without an ecosystem around it of alliances and joint ventures, it's you're just putting all your eggs in one basket. So moving to the next slide, this one actually just basically explains, and there is a recap here, which I'm not going to go over right now because this typically is a 1-hour webinar, because it comes illustrated with a number of examples. But again, analyzing 120 companies, I came up with the 12 do's and don'ts. If you want to be part of those 10 to 40% success, depending on what your goal is, if you want to be part of the 10% that really are going to get to a very large scale, or if you're at least want to be part of the other 30% that was going to be established sufficiently, there are certain do's and certain don'ts, which we could maybe have a follow-up webinar for anyone who would want to discuss them and see how that could apply to them, illustrated with specific examples. So I'll stop here, and Mark, I'll pass it back to you unless there are any questions or comments, and either now or in the future, I'm happy to. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jabril and John, for your insights. All right, give me a moment while I recenter us. All right. So to reacclimate where we were in the training, this is about doing business in the US. So how does the World Trade Organization, how do some of the trade agreements and provisions impact non-US based companies and their ability to bid on public tenders? How do you get started? What are the key terms? Because those will, if you understand those, then if the framework changes on you, you'll still be able to move forward. And then how do you get assistance from some experts here? All right, more alphabet soup. It's going to be a constant theme through this training. So the GPA, the TAA, and the FTA. Ooh, say that 3 times fast. All right, the GPA. I'm a kid of the 80s, so knowing is half the battle, G.I. Joe. Know your rights. So being informed, knowing what is and isn't allowed is really key to starting out here in the US. So what is the GPA? It's under the World Trade Organization, and there are a number of signatories to that. The US, many countries in Europe, several countries throughout the world are partners to that. And specifically, the Government Procurement Act, the GPA, sets forth a framework that allows non-domestic companies in signatory countries. So for example, US companies could compete in France, German companies can compete in the US, and any mix of the countries in between. And there are a set of standards and obligations that each government has to members of those signatory countries to allow them to compete for public-based tenders. So what does that mean? People who supply goods, services, construction works from signatory countries are treated no less favorably than domestic suppliers. Said differently, if a US-based company and a European company go head-to-head in a bid, they are both WTO countries, the GPA applies, and so both companies will be given similar considerations, not the same because there are differences, but very similar considerations when competing for public bids. So, and also that the process is to be transparent and fair. Now, those words can mean different things, but essentially people are treated the same. This rules are very similar. The playing field is meant to be level and very similar for each person. So what does it cover? It covers goods, services, and construction. So I believe that applies to all the people on this call. And throughout this presentation, you'll see resource links here. I'll make sure that a copy of this is provided for y'all's use, where we can click on it and you can find out more about each of these topics as we go through it, if you wish to do so. All right, so now with the understanding of the World Trade Organization and how the Government Procurement Act applies to European-based companies being able to participate fairly and equitably within the US procurement system, what is the TTA? So this is a Trade Agreement Act. This is trying to align with some trade acts that were done back in the 1970s. And it sets forth a TTA compliant framework. And what does that mean? This means that the US, so you've had the GPA, which is in and of itself a framework and agreement that allows people to bid, signatory countries to bid in the US. This is different. This is trying to maximize the US buying from countries that are allies and friendly to the United States. So this could have implications for national security or simply just wanting to reward friends. And so there are certain countries that are TTA compliant that have supply chains. We have trade agreements with them. Their governments are on friendly terms with our government. And so when you see TTA compliant, that means that you need to be from one of those countries. And many of the European countries, if not all, would be classified as TTA compliant. And that allows you to compete and to get on certain things like the GSA schedule. We'll get into that later in this training. But I just wanted you to be familiar that, there is this thing out there, TTA. So like if a company from China wanted to try to compete against a company from France on a GSA schedule, likely the company from France would be able to get on the GSA schedule, where the company from China would struggle, if not be denied, because of current geopolitical and trade alignments. So who's covered? WTO, so again, Europe would be in here. Some of our Caribbean friends close by, least developed countries. So this is, third, what we may not be politically correct, but third world countries, less developed countries, giving them a chance to compete for government funding. And then the free trade agreement countries. And we'll get into free trade agreement here in a minute. Is TTA compliance required for certain bids and certain schedules? The answer is yes. And if you wish to find out more about TTA compliance and all of that, there's a resource provided there where you can read more about it. All right, free trade agreements. So these generally are one-on-one agreements between a country and another country. Specifically here, this would be between the US and other partner countries, and it allows for greater market access, reducing tariffs, protecting intellectual property, eliminating barriers for importing and exporting. So is there a free trade agreement in place between the EU or UK and the United States? The short answer is no. Does that impact your ability to bid here in the US? Not really. It may have implications on import taxes and the cost of doing business here in the US, but fundamentally, because of your rights underneath, again, knowing is half the battle, your rights under GPA and the World Trade Organization, you are allowed to bid here in the United States on public procurements, even though there is not necessarily a specific free trade agreement between the US and the EU or US and certain European countries. I hope that answers our questions. So I wanted to set the framework. So basically saying, if I summed it up, are you as a European-based company allowed to bid on US jobs? Yes. And why? Because of the World Trade Organization and because of the GPA provisions. All right. Another key concept here to understand is the word entity. So this means basically shorthand for a company. There are generally many types of companies, but in this training, we're going to focus on US and non-US based entities. or companies. For this, oh, sorry, go ahead, Marta.
Yeah, just a question. Do we see in the bids at the federal level that they are respecting the WTO or the FTA? Is it signed in some way? Is it highlighted some way?
Yeah, so again, each bid is on their own. But what I would say is that there are certain provisions that can restrict European country or companies. So Buy American, basically, if there's certain, say, national defense or national security type bids for the Department of Defense, or if there are other provisions, say like funding from Congress at the federal level comes out, but it has a provision that says no, all materials have to be made here in the US. You might see restrictions, but as a general rule, you're not going to see the World Trade Organization specifically called out in bids from my experience. Now,
Okay.
it may be buried within what I'll get into, which is the Federal Acquisition Rules, or the FAR, another alphabet soup. But I'll show you that as we go along.
No, just for example, when we will search for tenders going through the federal agencies' websites, whatever, just to see if we find some tender, if there is somewhere notified that this is GPA respecting or FATA or whatever, so we can go, okay, this is open for us, or we skip it and go for.
I would assume that it's open to you. And then what I
Okay.
would look for in there that would limit you would
Yeah.
be Buy American,
Okay.
maybe prior experience requirements, like you have to have done 3 jobs in the United States from similarly sized government agencies.
Okay.
There are ways in which they can restrict foreign access to the bid without actually calling out that GPA doesn't apply.
Okay.
If I'm making any sense there. Excellent.
Okay.
Those would be the things I would look for.
Yeah, and that's where partnerships might also be useful, either subcontractors, local assembly, local manufacturers, licenses, joint ventures.
But I would say as a general rule, if you find a bid from a US federal government agency, you should start with the assumption that you can bid it. Okay, so if we go back to a great question, understanding an entity. So what is an entity? So it can include, in our terminology here in the US, corporations, limited liability corporations or LLCs, sole proprietorships. Essentially, these are what we would at a general level know as companies or businesses. What is the actual definition of a US entity versus a non-US entity? It basically comes down to the ownership percentage. 50% plus 1 share of the company is owned by a US citizen, then it's a US entity. If it's 50% and 1 share owned by non-US entities or non-US citizens, then it is a non-US entity business. And the reason that this becomes important is the requirements for you registering, the requirements for you to be able to bid differ slightly depending on whether you're a US entity or a non-US entity. For this training, I will assume, because it's European focused, that we are dealing with a non-US entity for most of the companies here. Now, with that said, if you are interested in becoming a US entity, I do wish to give you a little bit of like insight into what you might have to do do that if you wish. Again, I'm assuming that most people here will be non-US, foreign, but in case you are. So you have to choose your type of business structure. Again, LLC, corporate, sole proprietorship. You may have laws from your home country that dictate which of those options are available to you or not. You need to select which state or district or territory you're going to incorporate. One consideration would be business friendliness. Another way of saying that is, what are their laws and what are their taxes like? So some states are friendlier to businesses than others from a purely monetary standpoint. So Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, those would be places that are, I think, generally considered more friendly to businesses, as opposed to maybe California or New York or Illinois that are sometimes considered more legislative or more tax burdened states to deal with. You'll need a US bank account. You'll either need a physical US location or you'll need what's called a registered agent. And then you'll likely need to get a federal tax ID. So this is the IRS, the dreaded 3 letters of anyone here in the US. You'll need to get a number to be able to report your income and taxable income in that manner to be compliant. I highly recommend, if you are considering this route, you need to seek qualified professionals, legal, tax, accounting. There are so many different options here and so many different ways that this can play out. And they are highly dependent upon your specific needs and your specific business structure. This is meant to just be a general guide set of what you can expect if you were to become a US entity. Okay, next I'll get in if there's no questions here. SAM registration.
We
Again,
have a
Uncle
question.
Oh,
We have a
sorry.
question in chat from
Yes.
Mary that asks if it's difficult to obtain a US entity.
It's not difficult. It would be, again, I would say it can be time consuming. It might cost you a bit of money, but it's not, I would say, impossible or super difficult. Cool. Is there any follow? Okay. Is there a follow-up? Okay, excellent. Apologies. All right, SAM registration. Again, Uncle Sam kind of makes sense. We love, you know, our acronyms here. So what does SAM stand for? It's the System for Award Management. As a general principle with these systems that we're going to go into, registration is generally free. And so if you are required to register with the federal government, if you're required to use a system, more than likely it's going to be free because the government is not going to want to put up barriers to anyone participating. They're going to want to try to make the playing field or the business environment as friendly or as even as possible. And so it doesn't cost money to register, but it does cost time and you may need to hire an expert. So it may cost you some money there. One thing I would say is getting familiar with SAM. So it is the basis for your contracting with the US federal government. Said differently, you are not able to bid with the US government if you do not have a SAM registration. If you ever played the game Monopoly, this is like you go straight to jail, don't pass go, don't get your $200. This is your get out of free jail card in that game. So if you register here, a lot of the opportunities with actually all the opportunities with the federal government open up to you. It is the official system for doing business. So whether you're doing business with the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the GSA, doesn't matter. You need to be registered in SAM. Now, this is specifically for the federal level. The states and the local governments have their own requirements that are different from this, but this here is for the federal government. Some considerations is that if you want to apply also maybe for some grants, so maybe you do research, maybe you do some type of NGO or nonprofit work, you can apply. You would also need to get this registration to apply for those things. The net of this is that you will get what's called a unique entry ID, is specific to your company or your entity, that allows the government to know who you are and what you're doing when you put in your bids and when you do business with the US government. One item of note here is that there is a difference between what we consider a prime contractor and what we say is subcontractors. So let's understand what those two terms mean. The prime contractor means that over 50%, over half of the work on the contract or the awarded work is done by an entity. And then they may decide to have other entities, subcontractors, come in and help them out. So maybe the subcontractor does 10% of the work or 15% of the work. Subcontractor requirements are less rigorous, and you're not required to do as much as terms of registration and the various things as the prime contractor. So one tactic that, if I can connect some of these dots here, would be if you're thinking of coming into the US market, come in as a subcontractor. Look for opportunities where there may be a construction contract or there may be a contract that is dealing with a larger project, but lighting is a sub part of that. It's one part of many, and you can focus on the lighting. I believe this is a lighting consortium. So you can focus on that while the prime contractor focuses on building the rest of the building. And then your requirements as far as registration, reporting, tracking payments, all those things are less rigorous. Cool. All right, So what should you expect with SAM registration, since it's so critical to beginning your journey with doing business with the US government, the federal government? It's no cost to join. The application can take several hours. Sometimes there's entire courses, online courses that you can take that can guide you through SAM registration, which should give you an idea of maybe how complex or how long it might be. There are definitely government-specific terminology. Every bureaucracy needs its own. Ours is no different. It is also guided by what's called the FAR, F-A-R. These are guidelines for federal acquisitions. These are the rules that every federal agency needs to adhere to, needs to follow. There can be, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And then you will need codes of their own. And these codes can take time to get. So there may be some pre-steps. So if registering in SAM is step 1, these pre-codes might be step 0. You would need to do this before getting started in SAM. And they can be in-cage, we'll get into that, product service codes, EIN, the IRS, and then what we term here is DUNS numbers. Some of those can have very short lead times, like maybe 2 weeks. Others may have 30 days. Just for context here, the checklist, not the instructions, the checklist of the things that you need to do in SAM is about 18 pages long. The process for approval time can take about 6 weeks plus. So if you're thinking of trying to do business here in the US, factor in some of your step 0 activities, DUNS numbers, in-cage codes, IRS codes, and then also your application for SAM. You may be talking about 1 quarter, 3 months worth of time just to get started to be able to do work here in the US if you're considering being a prime contractor. I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, I have one question. This is the same procedure for the European companies that are, and for the American companies, or we have some additional sections to fill in or some additional documentation that might be asked from us?
Very great question. So the process is the same for both US and non-US companies. However, there are different steps or different parts of the process that will differ based on whether you are a domestic US entity or considered a foreign non-US entity. And so you may be required, for instance, to provide an in-cage code, which is a NATO designation, whereas the US companies may not.
Another question, if the company will have to upload some financial documentation there, I don't know, balance sheets, certified financial documentation that includes some sensitive information, of course, so like mainly from the economic financial point of view?
Yes, you do need to report on some of your financials. They'll ask about your corporate structure, who your corporate officers are, how much ownership stake each person has. Essentially, this is what the financial world would be calling know your customer. KYC it's a set of due diligence, basically saying, who is the US government doing business with?
Okay.
Are we doing business with anyone on the OFAC list, which might be terrorist organizations or anyone that's under sanctions? So that's from the financial perspective. Yes, you will be asked to give information so they know who you are.
To dial them, it means to enter them to some specific fields or to upload the documentation. Because this is linked to the second question. They have many European companies, they have their financial documentation in their local language. So French companies in French, Italian companies in Italian. So the one thing is to dial the data to the specific sections, and that's okay. And if we'll have to upload something, of course, if I'm not wrong, it will have to be translated, and no friendly translations are accepted in this case because they will have to be legally confirmed.
Correct. Yes. And so I think that is a very good point. And yes, you will likely, the official language, well, and we don't have an official, but the language we do business here in is in English. And so your documents will need to be in English because that is what the people on the other end are used to seeing. So again, they say here, no cost to join. but I think in these questions and what we're seeing here, it really isn't free. And so this, I think, is a good way of understanding. If you know the process, you know the terms, you know what you're dealing with, they say one thing, but the reality is slightly different. And as long as you understand how that reality is slightly different, you can operate very easily and know how to navigate moving through this process. Very good questions. All right, DUNS numbers. So these are, if we can go back here, we're going to go into some of the codes that you might have to have as prerequisites, your step 0, before starting your registration process. So what is a DUNS number? This is a universal numbering system. It's from Dun & Bradstreet here in the US. It was essentially the background, or the genesis of this was around credit reporting systems from the 1960s. And it's one of the unique identifiers or ways of standardizing at the federal level e-commerce. So what classification, what type of business is the federal government doing business with? And it's one of the ways that they figure that out from your unique number. It is required to pursue contracts with the US government. I did provide the Dun & Bradstreet website. Again, it's free to do. If you want to do the free route, it's about 4 weeks. There is an expedited timeline where they can get you one much quicker, but again, everything costs money. It is a fee. And so this is what it is. This is simply a paperwork exercise. And it's just to be able to provide a number that the federal government can use in their procurement system.
And this is one for company.
Yes, this would be at the company level. So
okay, so it's not for per product or service, but for company. Okay.
Correct. Yes, and very good distinction here. So this one is at the company level, and some of the ones we'll get into in a minute are at your service or your product level. And so I started at the top, and I'm working my way down. Excellent. In-cage code. Lovely acronyms again. So what is in-cage? This is a artifact of the NATO commercial and government entity. Mouthful. It's going to be 5 characters. It's an ID that we use here with the federal government. It's not solely the US. It's obviously NATO is European and some other countries. What is the goal? It's to basically increase efficiency and standardization between different countries. So if we think back to the WTO, we think back to the GPA, which gave signatory countries the ability to compete like domestic companies. In-cage is one of the ways that foreign companies can compete and work within a standard framework. It sets out that standard framework that allows for different companies to compete, where when we say Apple, we truly mean Apple. It's not apple and orange. So this is, again, so if we looked at DUNS, that's at the company level. This is again, at a company level, a supplier code. If you are a non-US entity, you will be asked to provide an in-cage code. Is there a cost for this? No. An in-cage code actually will be provided to you based on how you fill out your SAM registration at the end of your SAM registration. So you can actually, this is one of the prerequisites that you can get while you're doing your registration in SAM. So that can be assigned to you during this. It has been required since 2014 for non-US entities. And there is a method outside of SAM if you wish to get one just for whatever reason outside of the registration process. I linked to the page. Also, about every 5 years or so, I found conflicting information here, but I thought it was worth noting. This code does need to be updated about every 5 years or so, or it will expire. So I just didn't want anyone getting caught unaware that, again, with many of these things, there is a bit of maintenance that goes along with it. All right. Whew, another one, North American Industry Classification System codes. All right, so what does that mean? So this is more or less an artifact of North America. So think Canada, the US, Mexico primarily. And this is another way of classifying and analyzing the data of the companies and the products that are being sold by the companies to the US government. It came out of NAFTA, that's the North America Free Trade Agreement, and it covers the major countries here in North America. The reason that this would become important is many solicitations, notifications, RFPs, the opportunities you are seeking will be advertised based on the NIAC codes. So knowing your NIAC code, and we'll go into that here in a minute, what that is specifically with an example, will help you very carefully narrow down which opportunities apply to you, or which opportunities at least the government believes it is seeking to purchase. So if there were 5.8 million contracts, I don't want to look through 5.8 million opportunities. I want to look at just the 10 opportunities this week that apply to me. I did link to the manual from this year. So if you wish to read up, some good bedtime reading. All right, so what does a NIAC code mean? What is an example of it? So here you'll see the NIAC code 335122. And everyone is super familiar with that. But let's break it down. 33 is your manufacturing. So that's your manufacturing vendor. You add on the 5, it says you're under the electrical equipment and appliance manufacturing. Now you add in the 1, it's electrical lighting equipment within the electrical manufacturing. And then you add in the 2 here, and it's lighting fixture manufacturing. So if you produce lighting fixtures or you manufacture them and you're looking for opportunities, one of the NIAC codes, and I would recommend there could be multiple that apply to you. One of them that I would search on is 335122. And then any opportunity that has been classified or characterized by the US government as being searching for that product, you'll see that pop up in some of your search engines. We'll get into how to search for opportunities, how to narrow down realistic opportunities, how to find market research in module 2, maybe module 3, but that more detailed information will come. But I wanted to at least make sure y'all were familiar with what is a NIAC code, what are its components, and why is it important? All right. Product service codes, otherwise called PSCs. This is completely optional. So this is now more on the IT, the services side. So if we were looking at goods before and we were looking at the company level, now we're getting into the products and services. This is on the services side of that. This is a 4-digit code. It can be used in research and development. It can be used across different types of procurement. It is not required, but you can see here on the right, if you provide one of these 19 areas of service, again, it helps you narrow down your opportunities. It helps you match with your buyers. Again, you've got 20,000 something agencies. If you can do something to make it easier on yourself, my recommendation is that you try. If you've got, you want more information, there's some resources here. One item of note, the Department of Defense, they are one of the single largest agencies within the federal government that buys things. We do like our weapons, we do like our military here. And so they have their own rules, they have their own labeling system, their own classification system. So one item of note is that if you get the PSC here and you decide to, for instance, bid on lighting products for a military base, you might be bidding with the Department of Defense for that rather than the General Services Administration. Your product service code maps to the DoD equivalent. And the reason, I know it's kind of a nuance to call out here, but the DoD does spend a ton of money. And this may be one avenue for you to leverage some work if you're going for the general government into another high buyer part of the government. All right. EIN, or what's called a 10, depending on your entity type. This is related to the IRS taxes. So the only thing certain in life are death and taxes. Benjamin Franklin, we like him here. So taxes, that everyone's got to pay it. Depending on your entity type, you may get an EIN. So if you choose to be a US taxpayer, or a 10 if you're maybe a sole proprietorship, it could link to your, for non-residents, those kind of things. Again, I wanted to at least introduce the concept of the term. I am by no means an IRS or a tax expert. But I did want you to be aware that this may factor into what you need to consider if you're going to be doing business here in the US. And I have linked to additional resources here for doing businesses for small government or small businesses here with US government. I highly recommend you seek tax or accounting experts based here for your specific situation. All right, so now that I've sufficiently scared you and your eyes are as big as plates, what are some ways that we can make this easy? Can we push the easy button? Yes, you can. You don't have to do this alone. There are experts here. Again, I mentioned that the government tries to make things transparent. They try to make the playing field level, try to make sure everyone has a fair chance at doing it. So can you do it by yourself? Absolutely. Is it going to cost you money? Shouldn't cost you a ton. And in many cases, it can be free. Are there guides? Are there checklists out there? Yes. And I've tried to provide those in this training for you. But sometimes you're busy doing your own business. You've got things that you do. You don't have time to deal with this. So what it might be an alternative option. You can get third parties to guide you. They'll be able to guide you through SAM registration or potentially getting your in-cage code or your EIN if you wish. One resource I do want to advise here is that you are dealing with sensitive information. You are dealing with what I would consider crown jewels, financial information, who your board of directors are, how your corporate structure is done, some fairly sensitive information. Just be aware of scams. Do your due diligence. Make sure that this company's been around for a little while. Make sure that they've done this before. All the things that you would do if it was your own money or your sensitive information you were handing out. I do have a link here to the SAM registration help desk page that advises on being aware of scams, how to vet companies, potentially even some companies to go with. All right. So we have been at this for about an hour and a half. I propose a 10-minute break, but I'm also good to keep going. I defer to the group on what you would like to do.
I think we can give you a break. Thank you so much. Yeah.